So folks, we're going to go ahead and begin our program today, and welcome to our live stream tour of the story of Virginia here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. My name's Chris Van Tassel, and in addition, happy Veterans Day, because that's what we're celebrating this Wednesday. However, today we're going to go back in time before that holiday or even the United States existed. We're actually going to be looking at Virginia's colonial history. For any kids out there, if you've wondered quite what that word means, a colony is a place that gets controlled by another country somewhere else. And it gets established when people come over. And this is not always a happy story. It also involves conflict between the people who come and the people that are already here. So let's begin with who was already here in Virginia before any Europeans arrived. If you were watching our last video, we talked about the Native American culture in Virginia. This is a tabletop model of a town called Werowocomoco in the Algonquin language spoken by the Powhatans. And they were the chief group of people that occupied the eastern part of Virginia for many years. For thousands of years, Native Americans had been in Virginia. And by the early 1600s, the Powhatan chiefdom was a very complex society consisting of somewhere around 30 to 32 tribes, led by a man named Powhatan. This is what is in place when we move into the next chapter of our story. And we're going to look at a tabletop model here that shows the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay and the entry into what later becomes known as the King James's River. So for those of you who don't know, or just to refresh, the word Virginia was an idea before it was a place. The English had tried to establish a colony and call it Virginia previous to Jamestown. The Roanoke colony in present-day North Carolina was an early attempt. But in 1607, colonists on 3 ships from England crossed the Atlantic Ocean. They were part of an economic venture called the Virginia Company of London, in which people invested money in the hopes of creating a colony that would create wealth and profit for the investors. So from its get-go, Virginia is very much an economic idea. Now, they were hoping to emulate the success of the Spanish, who had conquered civilizations like the Maya and the Inca, and in the process, stolen a lot of gold and taken it back to Europe, part of that conflict we talked about. When the Virginia Company's settlers arrive and they start to explore the landscape, they discover there is not gold easily found, at least in Virginia. And so their next endeavor becomes simply surviving. And those early years, most of these people would have been located on this little blue triangle on an island in the James River, which represents the fort of Jamestown, again, named for King James. If we look at an earlier map of this river made by Captain John Smith, this was at one time called the Powhatan River. And as the English begin to settle and spread out, they do discover a way to make a lot of money, and it's going to be tobacco. One of the settlers, John Rolfe, who many of you know, eventually marries a woman named Pocahontas, the daughter of Powhatan. He experiments up near present-day Henrico at a place called Henricus. He's going to experiment with different types of tobacco from the Caribbean that grow really well in the Virginia soil. The result of that is what you see here. Within 15 years, the English expanded to all of these little red and blue settlements that we see on the map. The red and blue indicate a specific incident in 1622. The Powhatans realized that the land was being taken and decided to launch a preemptive attack against the English to try and reclaim some of their land. They managed to kill about a quarter of the 1,200 or so English that were in the colony. But ultimately, the English are going to arrive with greater numbers year after year. And after 3 major periods of conflict, the English have come to control and dominate the eastern part of modern-day Virginia. 1644 was the last significant uprising led by the now deceased Powhatan's brother, Opechancanough. After this, the remaining tribes in Virginia either migrated west and assimilated with other tribes. Some went north. Some remained in Virginia, but were restricted to land that we call reservations. And with the permission of the King of England at this point, they are given rights to territory here. We can see the Pamunkey and Mattaponi still have reservations there to this day. So while they become less of the story in colonial Virginia as more Europeans and later Africans arrive, do know that the Native American experience in Virginia doesn't end in this colonial period. In fact, to this day, there are 11 tribes federally recognized in Virginia. As we move along here, we're going to take a look at another body of water. Instead of the James River, we're going to look at the Atlantic Ocean. And on this map, we see a number of arrows, and we see the label Atlantic world is a term that historians use to describe the commerce and interaction between the three major continents, and really four, because sometimes this gets termed the triangle trade. A triangle has 3 points, and so Europeans, often English, would bring goods to Africa, and later this is going to develop into the slave trade, which we'll talk about a lot more in a moment. But as some products like spices, ivory, gold, and later humans are being taken to both North and South America by Spain, Portugal, the Dutch, the English. For Virginia, the triangle point would be here on the James River. That's going to be the point of contact for a lot of people entering the Chesapeake Bay. Some of the items that we see displayed in this case show some of that earliest point of colonial history. And again, when I say colonial history, I just mean the point from 1607 to 1776 when we declare our independence. But here we see a Dutch earthenware, sort of a ceramic tile that shows an African animal. In our catalogs, it's listed as a camel, but he also got a long neck, sort of looks giraffe-y. Obviously not a European or North American animal, though. So this is just one sample of some of that commerce that's going on throughout this Atlantic world. Now, this is going to create new nations, new colonies, but it's going to create a lot of suffering, especially for the people that already lived here. I mentioned earlier the Spanish colonial effort is going to enslave and militarily conquer a number of people, millions of people. To a lesser extent, we're going to see that happen in Virginia. While the population was smaller than we find in some points south, the conflict was still very severe. Now, as we come over to this wall, these are artifacts that were excavated by archaeologists, many of them working for a group called the Department of Historic Resources. And this is a settlement called Jordan's Journey. People still live there today. It's a sort of a suburban cul-de-sac place. And they like it for the same reason people originally settled there. It's got a waterfront view. And what we find here is that the material culture in Virginia wasn't like you would imagine today. People didn't own as much, but we do see the remains of some of those possessions on the wall. Now, for students, you might not recognize some of these items that are black and look rusty or corroded. That's actually after they've been cleaned a lot by archaeologists in a lab. And if I point to the one that says 23 under it, you might be able to identify that as an axe head. Keep in mind, a lot of the English in those early years had to bring things from England. There are no stores here. There were no iron foundries. There was one early on, but it got destroyed during conflict with the Powhatans, Falling Creek. So this is stuff that's got to be brought here. And one of the biggest challenges for those early colonists is that they were poorly supplied by the Virginia Company of London. Often they got materials that were a little old or not of great use back in England, ship them to the colony. And this is an example. This is a type of armor called jack of plate that was not the greatest type of armor. This is just what remains of a suit of it. And it's an example of some of the items that were being exported by the company to the colony. Now, as we come around the side here, I'm going to show you one other map on the wall here that ties into that Atlantic world that we just discussed. And this map is looking at that same geography, but with the theme of servitude. And many of you students know a servant is somebody who works for someone else. And there's different categories of people who are coming here and sometimes being brought here against their will. And both of these categories are what we would call unfree labor, but one is far worse than the other. Let's start with the one called indentured servitude. Through much of the 1600s, after tobacco became profitable, and here we can see a twisted leaf called a tobacco twist. This is a later version of what they're growing in Virginia. But tobacco requires a lot of labor. You need a lot of hands to make that crop grow. It takes a full year. And here we can see a little broadside that was published in England, in which King James initially did not like tobacco. He called it this filthy, disgusting habit. But once he saw the money that tobacco produced for his royal coffers, he got over that. And tobacco became what we call a cash crop. Again, beginning with John Rolfe, it grew well along the James River and throughout the state. And so initially, if I was a poor man in England and I'd heard about the Virginia colony, keep in mind, they didn't have the same avenues for social advancement. If I wasn't born a wealthy aristocrat or landowner in England, the odds of me being very successful were kind of low. But perhaps if you went to the colony, you could achieve more than you could back home. And so people gave up everything they're familiar with and got on a ship and came across the ocean, and they agreed to work for somebody already here for a certain amount of years, after which they would acquire their freedom. And so this is called indentured servitude. Indentured servitude is often for 4 to 7 years, depending on the quality of your skills that you bring with you. If I was a carpenter or a skilled tradesman, I might negotiate a shorter term for my indenture. And again, this is not a completely fair system. Many times indentured servants could be cheated or exploited and didn't have a lot of legal recourse in those situations. But it's very different than the system that comes to replace it, which is slavery. So most of you know that slavery is this practice of taking people from mostly the West African coast. The Bight of Biafra is the source of many enslaved people that wind up in Virginia. And this process begins in 1619. The first Africans arrive at Point Comfort, and we don't know everything about the status of the first Africans. There were no laws that defined slavery and said who was or was not, but we know from the outset they were treated as a separate class with less rights than the average English person. And throughout the 1600s, laws are going to be created to reinforce that. You might ask, who's making these laws? Well, the same year that Africans arrived, Virginia began an experiment in local democracy by establishing what we call today the House of, what they called the House of Burgesses. Today we refer to it as the General Assembly, as the full legislative body. Now the House of Burgesses, you could vote for your representative, called a Burgess, if you were a white man who owned land over the age of 21. And so we're going to see that expand, obviously, to this day in the United States, but 18 or older and a U.S. citizen are the only requirements. But in this time period, it was very restricted. So that becomes part of this story of Virginia, too, that we'll tackle in later tours as that franchise expands. Now, tobacco did create a lot of wealth. And for kids out there that may not know, tobacco has something called nicotine. It's addictive. It made it a very popular product. And for that reason, people invested heavily in it. And the wealthiest folks were people from England that were already from prominent wealthy families. We use the term gentry. These are sometimes related to the royal family, sometimes merchants, but people that owned land and a lot of property. They weren't the first people to come over to Virginia, but many of the names of these prominent families become known as the first families, even though they're arriving in the 1640s, 50s, and later than the original colonists. And here we can see one of the great collections here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture are our colonial portraits, because there were many wealthy Virginians who getting a portrait done was a way to demonstrate your status and really reinforce your legitimacy as a ruler. So if you went into a large home of an established Virginian, it's likely they might have portraits of their ancestors on the wall. I'm going to highlight the man up here, William Byrd II. He's got his hand resting on his hip and wearing the blue jacket there. He is typical of this gentry class. He's born in Virginia, but at the age of 7, he's sent back to England to go to school. He stays with family there. He gets introduced to English society and wealth as he grows up. And he learns languages like Latin and Hebrew and reads the classics, all the things that would be expected of an education for this class, and returns at the age of 22. And he becomes a minister to England from Virginia. He also is going to establish basically what today is Richmond and Petersburg. So he's in some ways the founder of Richmond. They say that it reminded him of Richmond near London, the way that the city looked on a bend in the James River, and thus the name is acquired. And then to the left here, we've got Lucy Park, who will be his wife. They're married, she's married at the age of 18, which was not considered young for marriage in this time period. But today, certainly we would think of that as a young woman. From all accounts, she was very independent and sort of chafed at the idea of being subordinate to her husband. Keep in mind, this is a very religious era. And when these English came here, they're part of the Church of England. Going back, Henry VIII had basically broken away from the Catholic Church and created a new church and said that he's picked by God and he's the head of this church. And in Virginia, that was the only game in town for much of this colonial history. If you wanted to worship or be part of the clergy, the Anglican Church, the Church of England, was also considered part of the government. They had the responsibility for caring for poor people, etc. We'll see how that idea of the church being part of the state will begin to diverge when we approach the American Revolution. I'll also point out Lucy Burwell up here, another fine portrait, the woman in blue and pink holding a lute. We don't know, there's no recordings from that time whether Lucy was a fine musician or not, but the intention of including that in the portrait was to show that she's a woman of leisure, that she would have the time to pursue these types of hobbies, which would certainly be beyond the reach of the average colonist, whose main daily endeavors is working in a field, going to church on Sundays, but very much people's lives back then were defined by work. Kids, there's no such thing as a vacation back then. You're probably working from a young age with the adults. And while work differed depending on whether you're of African descent or European descent, this is still very much centered around this tobacco economy. Now, tobacco, one problem with it. It's really bad for the soil, and people begin to use land and then migrate in search of new lands to cultivate. And this leads to a westward expansion that we can see illustrated, labeled Virginia's colonial backcountry. Now, I forgot to mention this, but I'll throw it in. If any of you do have questions throughout this tour, just throw them in the comment box, and in about 5 or so minutes, we'll stop and take a break and answer any questions you might have. This map shows a relief where the modern day border of Virginia is sticking out from the parameter of an older map made in the 1750s. This is called the Peter Jefferson Joshua Fry map. Peter Jefferson, probably most famous for being the father of Thomas Jefferson and the maker of this map. And you can see the geography. Virginia kids will know their tidewater to the Piedmont, to the Blue Ridge, to the Valiant Ridge, etc. But you have to imagine maps are drawn by people on paper. And there's a lot of math involved here that I'm not great with, but this becomes the job of a surveyor. And this was a politically powerful position to be granted. Now, I told you we had a House of Burgesses, but nobody voted for the governor. Governor was selected by the King in England and called the royal governor. And then they would assign people in the colony to carry out positions of authority. Well, one young man in Virginia gets basically commissioned to become one of the surveyors for Virginia and would have used tools like we see here. This is George Washington. At the age of 17, he becomes a very powerful player in this process of westward movement. He's going to be making the maps that will define what Virginia becomes. He basically surveys and does about 200 what we call plats. And this is a plat in Culpeper County defining a piece of property to basically legitimize the ownership of that. You could see the beautiful compass rose and the lovely way he spells his name there. Later, though, George Washington's venturing out west is going to bump him into another colonial power, which are the French. They are up in Canada, Quebec, and they had been up there trapping beavers for their fur to make hats. Crazy. This is how colonies work. People crossed an ocean so they could get beavers to make hats. And in the process, they're pushing east as the English are pushing west. For that part of the story, let's take a look at the other side. And we've got a map relating this titled The French and Indian War. Since George Washington was already an experienced frontiersman and had done a lot of this work, he's going to be commissioned to go out with the militia from Virginia to contest claims being made by the French in what we would call the Ohio Valley. Very fertile land that people wanted to get to, and very contested land. Now, along with these Europeans claiming the land, there are inhabitants, groups that you see here like the Shawnee and Iroquois. Many of them are put in the position of having to choose a side. And this is why we call it the French and Indian War, although in Europe they call it the 7 Years' War. This conflict spread to India and other parts of the world, being fought between the French and English. For our story, it takes place around here. And if you imagine the scenario, the map isn't really established the way we think of it today. The original inhabitants, the native people, didn't make maps the way Europeans did to enforce their claims. So do remember, when Europeans claimed something, it wasn't always a reality yet. This is what they are asserting, and this is why they're making maps to make those arguments. I won't go all into the history of the military because we're running short, but George Washington is very famous for engaging the French in a skirmish that basically becomes the first outbreak of the war, in which a French officer is shot. George Washington, is going to have to surrender to the French and return to Virginia, and he spends much of his time fighting on the frontier, actually against Native Americans through much of the French-Indian War. The war ends with basically a British victory. The French agree to withdraw, but if you look at the red line that goes along this section here, that goes along with a line that was drafted in 1763 called the Proclamation Line of 1763. Essentially, King George III said, hey guys, we just fought a war with France. It was really expensive, and it really angered a lot of these Western tribes. And if you keep going out there, it's going to create more conflict. So please just stay where you're at. Well, if you imagine the motives of the colonists, that's not what they want to hear. They fought a war with France so that they could take that land. And now they're being told to stay back. That's one thing that angers many of these colonists. The second thing is that because the war was very expensive and fought for the benefit of the British North American colonists, the king and parliament, who make laws in England, say that they need some of that money back in the form of taxation. So in 1765, they introduced what we call the Sugar Act. You got to pay a tax on sugar. People didn't like that. Again, Virginians and now 13 colonies, including Virginia, had gotten used to this idea of local representation, that they voted for their local assemblies. And the idea of taxes being made by people that they didn't vote for becomes known as taxation without representation. This becomes a rallying cry for people who wanted independence. And we'll use the term patriots here because as we wrap up, we're approaching the American Revolution. Here's King George III. If we can see through the glass, that's a small portrait of him. He's the last monarch or king of the British Virginia part of British Empire. And over here we see a red colonial seal that may not show up well, but that was basically the colonial seal that enforced his authority. Above here we see a portrait or a painting of Patrick Henry arguing a speech called the Parson's Cause. And we'll wrap up with this, but I mentioned that the Anglican Church was part of the state government. And because they didn't have banks and cash a lot of the times, tobacco was used as a form of currency. And Anglican ministers, preachers, were supposed to be paid 16,000 pounds of tobacco per year for their service. Without going too deep into the case, basically the problem with making tobacco money is that one year tobacco might be very valuable, the next year the price of it might drop, or it might rise again. And in Virginia, the price had risen to the point where the ministers were basically getting a huge raise, which affected the coffers of the colonial government. So Patrick Henry basically, they try to make a law establishing a fixed rate for tobacco to be paid to ministers. The king vetoes it. And in this speech, Patrick Henry basically says any king that will overturn the decisions of our local assemblies is not a legitimate king. So this is very early in the 1760s, before many people are calling for independence. But of course, Patrick Henry becomes one of the biggest promoters of independence, and we'll pick up with him again when we get to the American Revolution. Now, there is a lot we didn't talk about in this short tour, and I think colonial Virginia is difficult to tackle because it's 169 years. So certainly if you have any questions in the comments, I'm happy to take those now. And thank you for tuning in.
All right, Chris, so while we wait for people to submit any questions they have, can you tell people where to look if they want to join us another time?
Yes, of course. So here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, if you want to visit our website, it's just virginiahistory, all one word, .org. And on events and education tabs, you can find out all kinds of programs we offer, upcoming events. Tours like the one I just did are presented twice a month. And sometimes they'll be chronological through the exhibit. Sometimes they'll be thematic. But you're welcome to check that out, and please visit the website.
So it doesn't look like we have any questions, and we're about out of time. So Chris, you can go ahead and wrap us up and take us out.
All right, well, I'll just show you a transition that we'll see next time, which is going from a British flag to a new American one. And what we're going to be talking about is the story of how 13 colonies overcome differences and create a single identity and begin to think of themselves as Americans. And that will be the end of the colonial chapter in Virginia's history.